Hi, welcome to IB History of the Americas. This is our lecture on the end of the war, World War II. So the Western Soviet victory. And what we're going to talk about here is the time period from about 1942-43 until 1945 when the war kind of wraps up. We're going to go over it quickly and efficiently. If you have any questions about anything, please write those down. You can ask me. Also, rewind the video. It's always a great thing to do with technology. All right, make sure you take good notes so you can be ready for the discussion that we're going to have afterwards. So, talking about the Western Soviet victory, let's first talk about the American impacts that are finally starting to be felt in World War II. First, we have Lend-Lease. All right, this was finally extended to the Soviets as soon as they joined the Allies. Of course, once they were invaded by the Nazis in July 1941. And so by about 42-43, streams of American vehicles, clothing, food, supplies of all kinds, they're making its way to the USSR through the Arctic and the Persian Gulf. And the Soviet plants themselves are now finally really starting to increase their output heavily by about 1943. So the Soviets are really starting to become outfitted with a really modern military. And so this is what's helping them to really start pushing the Nazis back. Now, the Soviets were upset that the Americans were not on mainland Europe. And so what they did, the Americans tried to appease the Soviets, saying that, yes, we are helping you. So what they did is they did a big bombing campaign. You should have already started reading about this in Davies' book, but what's happening is, as the Anglo-American bombing is happening, it's cutting into German airplane production at home. And you have to understand, the Allied contribution to this all was essential, but for Stalin, really, it was never enough without a true second front. Okay, so that they wouldn't be taking the majority of the Nazi army against them. If you think about it, though, compared to the Soviets, the Allies did not lose nearly as much. Okay, the Soviets lost more men in Stalingrad than America did during the entire war. All right, 20 to 25 million people end up being killed in the USSR, and a lot of those are civilians. These are due to the Einsatzgruppen who were working under the SS. And what these guys were, they were mobile killing squads. Okay, they also promoted things called pogroms. And what happened was, this is where locals would really get involved in killing Jews. And many believe that the amount of Jews killed after the initial entry into the USSR is really impossible if not for these pogroms. So they had a very big role to play. It wasn't just the Nazis killing them, but people themselves really got involved. It's very, very sad. One particularly sad story is actually from the Kaunas pogrom in Lithuania. And what happened was, the so-called death dealer of Kaunas. This was a young man who went around murdering Jews with a crowbar. And what he did is he did it all in front of a big crowd. There's actually a picture from it. He went around killing them in front of a big crowd who cheered every time he would kill somebody. And then ever so often he would stop to play the Lithuanian national anthem with his accordion. Before then he would then follow that with resuming the killings. It's very, very sad and very, very tough to even really think about that this actually happened. But on the other side of that, new hope did begin. So the Americans are starting to become more successful in the Solomon Islands in the Pacific by the end of 1942. And there's also a slow throttling of German subs in the Atlantic. And so this really starts to bring new hope at the end, or at the beginning of 1943. And by August 1943, British, Canadian, American troops, they conquer the island of Sicily. And Mussolini is actually ousted at this time by his confidants. And the 21-year-old regime in Italy, Mussolini's regime, came to an end. By September, Italy signs an armistice with the Allies, and a month later declares war with Germany. But Germany then invades in the same month and takes over northern Italy. What happens then is up here, they set up an Italian social republic. Okay, that's what the Germans call it, and they rescue Mussolini by German paratroopers. All right, and they create kind of a German puppet government up there. But by 1945, Mussolini ends up being assassinated by anti-fascist Italians. And anyways, the Allies are attacking from the south at this time, moving up from Sicily and going into Italy. The Germans are stubbornly trying to stop the Allies from taking Rome, but despite them setting up new, different beachheads, and it really starts turning into a long stalemate and a lot of urban, brutal warfare. Because what happened was the Allies didn't really send a ton of troops at this point because they were amassing them for something larger. And this is the invasion. Okay, Europe at this time, it's known as Festung Europa, meaning that every kind of fortification that science and military minds could think of had basically fortified Europe. The Nazis had built this where soldiers could reach any area very quickly due to rail and communication lines. Especially in the West, this is set up as a big fortress. Okay, therefore, the Allies had to make an amphibious attack unlike any before. So for weeks, the Allies gave out false intelligence reports pointing to that they would attack, and their main thrust of their attack would be at Calais. I remember reading about one story where they actually used a soldier who had died, and they used his body, they put false intelligence reports in it, and they dropped him off in the ocean, and he came up. I think it was in Italy. So the Germans found him there, and on the body he had like special documents saying, talking about that there was going to be a big attack on Calais. Now, the Nazis believed that that's where it was going to be. So then, what they did instead, the Allies, they sent 4,000 ships, and they carried troops and supplies directly across the channel into Normandy. Okay. And so Operation Overlord began on June 6, 1944. During the early hours of June 6, 1944, they parachuted troops behind enemy lines to sabotage communication lines and artillery placements. In order, basically, they would blow these things up so they'd be able to make the main beach landings more successful. Then British, Canadian, and American troops, they landed their sea and air forces, which were backed up by huge amounts of supplies under General Eisenhower, and they assaulted the French coast. And so they established a beachhead there, and they maintained a front. And over 130,000 men landed on the first day. And within a month, it was up to 1 million people. Now, I've uploaded some videos on the Moodle about this. Okay, there's a scene from Saving Private Ryan that looks at Overlord, looks at D-Day when they arrive on the beach. Warning, it is graphic, so if you're a bit squeamish, you don't need to watch it. It's just so you'll be able to visualize what we're talking about and how brutal this was, okay, and how brave really those soldiers were when they went out to fight. Now, the German fighting force was pretty formidable, okay. They were much better than the Americans and the Western Allies when they came, and even though the Germans were outnumbered, they were able to slow the Allied advance. American troops actually would have to constantly call in reinforcements and air bombardments for support, and it took them a little bit longer to be able to get into mainland Europe, deeper into German-held territory. But the Germans, it did happen. The Germans were pushed back. And by August, Paris was liberated. By September, the Allies were actually closing in on German territory. In France, Italy, and Belgium, resistance movements were able to come into the open and finally help kick out their oppressors. In Germany, there was actually a very small resistance movement that tried to assassinate Hitler on July 20th with a bomb. July 20th, 1944 with a bomb, so that's a little bit later. But this failed, and of course Hitler took out his revenge on the conspirators. But it shows that there were pretty vast conspiracies against Hitler, trying to get rid of him. In August, the Allies also landed on the French Mediterranean coast, and they swept up through southern France to join the Allies advancing against the stiffening resistance. Then suddenly, though, there was a startling reversal, and this actually happens again up here in the Ardennes. Okay, and this is known as the Battle of the Bulge. Basically, what happens is there's a sudden German drive under Hitler's personal orders in December 1944, and what it was unleashed under radio silence, meaning that the Germans weren't allowed to talk on the radio during this time, so the Allies wouldn't kind of overhear that there were big troop movements. And what they did is they wanted to push back into Europe, and they really focused on this city here, Bastogne. And what it was it was a major crossroads that the Americans saw as important, but the Germans also saw as important. If they were to push back into the West, they would want to have this territory. The Americans got there first, and they pushed up there, but then the Germans attacked, and what they did is basically created a bulge. If you look here, a bulge in the American line, and as you can see, if this is how the lines were before, then the Germans push in, there's a big bulge. And so what happened was there were troops, the 101st Airborne Division specifically was surrounded in Bastogne. Okay, and they had to try to hold this territory as they were surrounded by the Germans. When called to surrender, the Allied commander actually replied to the Germans in a telegram saying all it was nuts. N-U-T-S. That's it. It's quite actually a little bit comical because you can't translate that into German. So when the weather cleared, though, finally, they bombed the Germans, and the German effort, then they were pushed back. And really at this point, the Germans were really out of fuel.